Hello, good morning, everybody. Uh, Thank you for joining us today on the webinar, Unlocking Success, a special two-panel series for EDOs and attracting Google data centers and preparing competitive sites. I am just ecstatic to be presenting the panelists today and moderating these sessions. My name is Aaron Brissois. I'm the CEO of Golden Shovel Agency, and most of the people listening in today are going to have known me since this is a special event for Golden Shovel Agency clients. The people that you're going to be hearing from today over the course of these two panels are absolute tops in their fields, and I believe we're going to be in for a real treat. And without further ado, I want to introduce a special guest, which is Tony Burkhart. Tony leads the economic development, negotiation, and market development policy within the energy and location strategy organization at the Google data centers. This includes things like setting the internal economic development strategy, guardrails, policy positions, and he advises on site selection strategy, and he works with industry coalitions and public policy teams to advise them on economic development policy and strategy. Tony has over a decade of economic development experience, and in that time, he has also led the Amazon Web Services economic development and site selection practice for the Eastern US and Canada and the Middle East. And so he's also, previous to that, led Lockheed Martin's economic development practice and specialized site selection for Skunk Works. And before entering the private sector, Tony was Director of Business Development for Enterprise Florida under Governor Rick Scott. Tony, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Aaron. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it.
You bet. I think I'd like to start off before we jump into our first panel and give you a moment to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, I think you covered the highlights from a professional standpoint, but I guess I come to this field like a lot of us, partly by accident. So I'm originally from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I always thought I would go work in automotive or something like that, and then I happened to leave college in 2008 when everything was imploding, and that wasn't an option. And so having gone to school for public policy, I started looking around for different opportunities, and there was one in Florida which I had only ever been to for vacation, and I ended up moving down there on a lark and I ended up living there for almost 6 years and split my time between the governor's office and Lockheed Martin when I was living there. But I tell you that story because I kind of come to this with a little bit of passion for how do we create policy that actually sets us up well as either state or local governments for economic development. Because I grew up in a town that was not well set up for economic development at the time. Things are getting better here, but we were a one industry town in Detroit, and when that industry went away, we kind of saw the damage firsthand to friends and family and things like that, and it was really pretty devastating, right? So I've worked in a couple of industries now, but I've really focused on data centers for the last 5 years, I guess, which is crazy. It's been 5 years already. So I came out of the defense world and was mostly working on aerospace or space or military projects, and walked into the data center space. And I thought originally, like a lot of other folks, well, it's just a bunch of computers in a warehouse, right? How complicated could it be? And it turns out it's actually pretty complicated. So, and I think the other thing that I didn't realize until I really got into the weeds of data center site selection and data center economic development is, what do data centers actually power in our day-to-day lives, right? So one example that might be obvious is this webinar, right? Some data center, some computer, somewhere, some server that's sitting in a warehouse is making this video call happen, right? It's not your computer that's actually processing all the data that's going back and forth between you, me, and everyone else on the phone. It's a server somewhere. And if you start extrapolating how many things a day you use that actually require some sort of a data center, I think most people would be surprised, right? So when we all get done with this tonight and you go home to your family and you cook dinner and you get tired and you want to watch something on your phone or on your TV, whether it's Netflix or YouTube or whatever, that's all being run out of a data center somewhere, right? So when you start to extrapolate that, it gets pretty big. And recently, the trend that's really accelerating data center growth and data center development is AI and ML. And so as AI grows and continues to find new applications and new uses, the demand for compute power goes up too. So this is not a Google specific thing. This is really a data center industry-wide issue, right? I mean, Amazon and Microsoft have their own AI powered services or machine learning powered services, stuff that you've probably heard of, whether it's Google's AI like Bard or it's Chat GPT, right? Those are, again, data center or cloud compute powered processes. So every company really has it, but it even kind of filters down into some of the minute things of different services that you probably use all the time. So like if you use Gmail, for example, or you use Google Sheets, those are all those files are not saved on your computer, right? They're saved in the cloud. So in your Google Drive or wherever, you can access them from any desktop anytime, pick it up, log into your Google account, and it's all there. You don't need that specific computer to make that work. But even the level beyond that, right? So if you type something in a Google search bar and it tries to predict what you're looking for, so you can just click enter and it'll fill it in, or you're trying to look up a website and it kind of knows what website you're trying to go to, that is an AI or an ML powered load. So the more and more that we start finding these small ways to add that AI capability into products that you probably use all the time already, all of those, all of the load on that goes to some data center somewhere. And so, as our economy gets more digitized and increasingly moves to this sort of hybrid work environment, right, the demand for these services is just going up and up and up. And we have to, as data center providers, keep up with that. So for me, knowing that that's the business need, then the next step is, okay, well, what does the community need? And how do we create good partnerships with communities so that everyone is getting the benefits of that growth in AI and ML, right? And I'm sure there's probably a lot of questions about that specifically, but that's really the idea. So, data center policy and good economic development policy really ends up kind of being a blend of infrastructure policy and then sound tax policy. So there's different components to that, and we can talk about those later if folks have questions about it. But, generally speaking, these are very large infrastructure projects. They don't, we don't pretend that it's like manufacturing projects where we're talking about thousands of jobs. However, the economic multiplier of the jobs that data centers do create, we've found that to be through some recent studies. For every data center job, there's 6 additional jobs created in the local community, and that doesn't include the jobs that are effectively created or the businesses that are supported by being able to like find something on Google Maps, for example, or look up a restaurant review on YouTube, right? All of those things still drive value to communities. But our real quest is how do we use the data center to drive economic development at the local or the state level? So that's kind of my spiel, and that's sort of what we're working on right now is looking for answers to all these different questions and trying to create good partnerships to move forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Tony. Excellent introduction. Interesting. I really appreciated each job at a data center creates 6 additional jobs. I think that's fascinating. I think it'd be a good time, since our first panel is going to be discussing data centers and the attraction of them, to introduce our other 2 panelists. The first person I'd like to introduce is Catalina Valencia. She is the Executive Director of Business Development for the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. Catalina leads a statewide team tasked with building a pipeline of business development opportunities for business attraction, retention, and expansion in the state of Minnesota. She works closely with external partners to leverage relationships and resources to market and increase the visibility of Minnesota. And previous to this role, she was the founding principal of TerraFinder Consulting, which is a corporate location strategy and economic development consultancy, as well as a senior site selection consultant at Global Location Strategies. And even before that, served as the business development director for Greenwood County in South Carolina. Catalina, welcome.
Thank you, Aaron, for that introduction. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Happy to have you here. And let me also introduce to you Matt Marshall. Matt's worked in the economic development industry for 10 years as a consultant, local economic developer, actually for West Fargo. But he currently serves as the utility industry, or serves in the utility industry for member services, rates, and economic development manager for Minkota Power Cooperative in North Dakota. Matt brings expertise in economic and community development space in the fact he's completed multiple regionally recognized projects in both Minnesota and North Dakota, including data center projects. And beyond that, I know Matt for a long time. He's a Mid-America Economic Development Council member. He's part of the Economic Development Association North Dakota and the North Dakota Workforce Development Council. Welcome, Matt Marshall.
Thank you, Aaron. Nice to be here.
That's nice. So Matt can bring a little of the utility perspective. So let's jump into this. And my first question is going to be for Tony, and you may have hit on a couple of these topics as we started here. Tony, what factors typically lead to Google conducting a site visit when considering a location for a data center? And on that note, how can EDOs best position themselves to attract, such visits if they're wanting to have Google come check out what they have going on?
Yeah, so it's going to be kind of a two-part answer, because I'll give you more the Google side of it and more I've been in the data center world for a couple hyperscalers for a while. I'll give you like a blended answer, okay? So the blunt answer is, if we're doing a site visit, it's because we don't know enough about the site, and we think it's got most of what we want. But to be honest, I would prefer to avoid having to physically get on an airplane and go look at a site. So the reason I say that is because one of the things that we've been talking about more and more on our side of things is sort of this idea of certified sites, right? So going through and having all the geotechnical work done, having all of the power documented in an obvious delivery schedule that the community can share with us or with our consultants. So, ideally, we have as much of the work done up front as possible, right? Mm-hmm. Now, that's a little tongue-in-cheek, because obviously, if we really like a site, we're still going to go out and visit it, and we're going to talk to folks locally. But we got to get there first. And so the big picture stuff, in terms of like data centers in general, these are large projects. They're not small. So if the world is now in certain markets, if I have to be in Northern Virginia, for example, I'm probably going to make some compromises on these things. But all things being equal, and not having a strong regional tie, I'll say, then typically what I'm looking for is sites of at least 100 acres. Ideally, they're flat. Ideally, they're easy to buffer. In other words, not close to major population centers. Google data centers are certainly, they're large, but we don't want to infringe on the community, right? We don't want everyone driving down Main Street and seeing a Google data center every single day. Power-wise, and this is really where the rubber meets the road, I think, for the most part, we would prefer that sites have at least, if not more than, 80 megawatts of power ready to go on day one, and it's going to be more or less a 100% load factor. There's some nuances to that depending on where you look around the country, but the more of it that's available, the better. Like 80 megawatts is kind of the floor, and if we're trying to go quickly, ideally, I don't want to go look at sites where it's going to take 5 years to get to 80 megawatts, right? I want to have the ability to scale those sites as quickly as possible. So if it's there right off the rip, great. If I can get 200 megawatts, even better. If I can get a gigawatt in 5 years, even better, right? More power is better. Caveat to the power, though. So Google and AWS and Microsoft, for that matter, all have 100% carbon-free commitments. Google's already met ours. We're pretty far ahead of schedule on that, and we do that through a variety of different mechanisms. But one nuance for us is we do actually consider nuclear to be part of our carbon-free energy load. So it's not all solar and wind, but being able to have that there for 5-ish per kW would be ideal, and not have a significant cost adder is really like what we're looking for. So and I won't get into the networking conversation because that's sort of, it's either there or it's not, and typically that's going to be the result of more federal policy than it is going to be state level policy to get the fiber backbone. But yeah, so bigger is better, more power is better, and ideally as much carbon free energy as possible is really what we're looking for.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's an awful lot of power. Catalina, what role does the state play in providing support to communities in their efforts to attract data centers? I know you bring a unique perspective from the state of Minnesota. How do you recommend that communities best engage with the state?
So we work very, very closely with our different partners, especially the utilities when it comes to data centers, with data center projects. These are projects that are mainly driven by power, at least what we've been seeing in the state. So of course, that connection and the work that we have with our power utilities is very important. And the work with our economic development partners and the different localities is very important. Our power utilities, for the most part, have their own shovel-ready programs, and many of them for many years have focused efforts on developing and readying sites for data centers. So we already have a set of sites across the states and communities that, of course, have been the hosts of those sites that traditionally receive a lot of looks for data center projects. But with that being said, what we are also finding out is that with these very large demands for power, land, water in some instances, we need to be looking beyond what is already available. And in many instances, looking at communities that probably we hadn't looked into in the past. So those connections, I would say, primarily with our utility partners and making sure that we are talking to them and making sure where they do have the capacity available to serve these projects is where we get started when looking at sites that are not already identified.
Great, thank you. Matt, as you successfully attracted data centers to your territory in the past, could you share some of the strategies on how EDOs effectively partner with utilities to meet these infrastructure needs of the data centers? And maybe just if you have any considerations or potential challenges as far as the partnerships are concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you, Tony and Catalina. Those are great comments, spot on. First and foremost, when local EDOs are preparing for this, they need to go and meet with their utilities. And as Tony and Catalina pointed out, Tony doesn't have the time to wait for the infrastructure to be built or the capacity to eventually get there someday. And your utilities will likely be very honest about this is where we have capacity and this is where we don't, and what the potential is to get it there. And so every community is a little different. I think what I would tell them is there's two parts of capacity. There's substation capacity, which a lot of people really focus on, but to get to those large levels, you also need the transmission capacity available. And sometimes that's more complex, especially when it gets into the timelines that a Google or another data center would look at. Because our grid is interconnected, you have to do studies a lot of times for interconnects. And those studies now are so far down the path, that's where you run into some hiccups and some trouble. On our end, we successfully recruited several because we were prepared and ready. It was a strategic initiative of ours. And we had local communities working closely with us. and we had slash have capacity in those areas ready to go. The other thing that I think people don't always think about is that the other utility requirements, it'd be great for Tony maybe to lay out, how they look at them. But from time to time, you'll, depending on the type of data center, there will also be a water requirement that goes with it. So on the one hand, you need to be away from a metropolitan area where you might not have those water resources, but yet you need the water capacities in case they use that for cooling. And as your local economic developers know, utilities out in the middle of counties are not as robust as in their cities. And so, just understanding from a local perspective, the electric utility is mission critical. You have to have that lined up, working with your utility. But then some of these companion utilities as well, the water, you have to have those discussions and be prepared for that as well.
Right. It's a lot more than just power. Those projects that large require all that land, and not to mention the water resources.
Yeah, as Tony mentioned, they're huge projects, very comprehensive. And so it's not just one thing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, Tony, you can certainly comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, I usually focus on the energy first and foremost because that's the longest lead time item in most cases, exactly as you said, Matt, right? Those interconnect studies, if you don't have the transmission capacity, it's pushed. I mean, there's certain markets where this is definitely an issue, right? Like Northern Virginia, Dominion is going to have a hard time, I think, delivering the amount of capacity that AWS has gone out and publicly said they want in that region. That's going to be very challenging just from a policy standpoint. So, and then the second tier is obviously substations, right? Those can be built a little bit faster, but primarily we're looking at high transmission areas where there's a lot of available energy. The water piece of it, though, so there's different data center designs. I guess this is a nuance that people may or may not know. There's a big difference between hyperscale data centers, co-location data centers, and then something that gets mixed up with us a lot is like cryptocurrency miners and things of that nature, right? Those are all going to be pretty different. We tend to use water-cooled data centers to the extent that we can. I can't say that that's true of all those other kinds of data centers, but we do have air-cooled options. So this is another reason why the water infrastructure is deprioritized a little bit under the power, because even though air-cooled is more expensive, there are ways to do it where there are water constraints, depending on the market. If we're talking about Phoenix, Arizona, yeah, it's probably not going to be an air-cooled data center. But yeah, water capacity is pretty significant, right? And it's not just how much water are we delivering, but how much wastewater capacity. That usually tends to be the bigger issue, is actually, can we get, upwards of 1 million gallons a day of wastewater capacity? And that's going to make the ability, from my standpoint, the ability to have the option between water cooled and air cooled, and knowing that we have enough, usually wastewater capacity to deliver, is helpful, right? It's going to put a site higher up on the pecking order, because now I don't have to go with an air-cooled option. I can also look at water-cooled. And when you think about the way that things get approved internally at large companies, right? There's a lot of people that are bringing forward sites to leadership, and they're going, look at the site that I've put together, and leadership's going to sit there and poke holes in every one of those sites, and they're going to pick the best one. So we're kind of competing even internally as to which sites are going to get selected. And so every little thing, like, do we have the optionality to do water or air cooled, is going to matter, right? Do we have the option of doing a PPA? Do we have the option of pulling energy off of a nuclear power plant? All those kinds of things add up. And then we're going to decide, as a company, where are we going to take our capital and invest it? And that could be anywhere in the country.
Tony, just to build on that, interesting to hear that even internally, they're competing for the sites that you guys put together. Our clients are certainly going to be interested in, how do they go about marketing to you? How do you find out about these communities? Is there anything they can prepare to catch your eye or interest?
That's a good question. So there's different mechanisms, right? I guess I would say that, you know, the best way to do to get the direct contact is build a relationship, you know, be in the right place at the right time, and find folks on the North American regional delivery team. Like that's the best case scenario. If you happen to run into someone, you can build a relationship with them. But you know, barring that, and if I was an economic developer, and when I was an economic developer, that's definitely was my preference. So I spent a lot of time on the road, you know, trying to get meetings with people, and you know, show up to company headquarters and ask for site tours and things like that. Right, go to the company. That's usually ideal. Not have them come to you, because most of the time they're not going to. I guess the more common stream though of like how we find sites is usually a combination of developers, and we do actually use, I'm not going to tell you who, but we do use a couple of like nationally recognized firms that keep an inventory, and we look through those things and then we go and do our own due diligence on them. But that initial pre-screening is usually outsourced. So
Got it.
yep.
Perfect. This would be a nice transition for Catalina. Because you mentioned that there's an inventory of potential sites. And Catalina, maybe you could speak a little bit about how, I guess I have two things particularly I'm interested in. One is your perspective on a site that loses, how it doesn't necessarily win the data center project, how that might still be in an inventory somewhere. But I also would really like you to speak to the data center tax credit program that Minnesota, I mean, it's really put Minnesota on the map. And just maybe a little bit about how incentives play a role in attracting data centers from your perspective.
Thank you, Aaron. So what we are finding out with the data center projects we've been working on is that in many instances, at least for the opportunities we've been working on, companies are looking at properties not only from the perspective of what's that next location where we are going to be setting our next data center, but also in how those different sites that you bring to the table can make it into the company's pipeline, that eventually they'll continue running due diligence, looking into, and eventually it may be a site that may not win the project today, but may be in that pipeline for some time down the road, coming on to being that one next site to be developed. So that's what we are finding out, that these relationships with data center opportunities are very long-term. We've been working projects for a number of years, and what we are discovering is they don't discard sites. They continue looking at those sites because it may not be the next one, but down the road, it may be one that may be feasible for some other follow-up plans. So that's what we are finding with many of these data center projects. In terms of our data center sales tax credit, is a tax exemption for 20 years for data center projects. And that definitely has put Minnesota on the map. We find, and that's also another thing that is very common to, or with these data center projects is, as Tony mentioned, when we hear about a project and when that project connects with us, there's already a lot of due diligence, a lot of work that has happened when they come to us, and they already have a set of sites that they've been looking into and have made some initial contacts on, or have been in the background and backstage running some due diligence or investigation on those properties. So when they come to us, what we've found out is that data center tax credit incentive is a key driver to have companies looking to Minnesota. So that's been a critical component. We find that no other incentive can match, what that tax credit incentive does for our state in attracting projects. We don't need to be talking about any other program is pretty much focused on that data center when it comes to discussing incentives. So again, it's critical for us to have that tool, and we found out that it's definitely put Minnesota on the map when it comes to attracting opportunities. I also would like to mention, building on the comment that Matt had earlier about the substation capacity and the transmission capacity. Something that we are also finding out is again, these are long-term projects, and in many instances, the way to approach them requires not only a strategy or a work plan by the power utility or the state, or in many instances, considering the dimension of these projects, it pretty much requires a statewide strategy where you bring in together the power utilities, the community, the state, the economic development organizations, because of the dimension of the improvements that would be required to be able to serve a project with the requirements of some of these opportunities. And sometimes it's very hard finding that balance as to how much steam you put into these projects, considering that you don't know how you are falling in that pipeline and in that order of priority for the company. And if you ever, as a state, will be considered for those plans. So should you be putting all the steam and making the investments? And because sometimes this involves looking into these transmission studies that, as Matt pointed out, many years need to go by to have those developed. And that's only the study. That's not even making the improvements. So how much effort, how much investment you put into trying to make those changes happen when you still have these long-term processes of location decisions happening, that balance is a challenging one. And we are facing that right now with one of these opportunities. So those are the things we are encountering. And I also wanted to build on Tony's comment about how to how communities should be marketing to data center companies. And we found it very, very useful for us. We've been able to identify and drive opportunities using some key events that exist around the data center world, where we've been able to connect with some of these opportunities, be it directly a company or a developer that is developing for data centers. And through those connections, we've been able to drive some of the current opportunities we have in the data center industry.
Yeah, thank you, Catalina. Excellent. That kind of brings up that whole chicken and the egg. It's an awful lot of work and investment to be prepared for a data center, but then you don't know if there's going to be one, and how much energy and effort do you put towards that?
Yeah, I would just say if there's a local economic developer out there that wonders, where they sit, I am assuming, and Tony could verify this or not, but any utility has been communicated to a lot recently in the last 5 years about capacity for data centers. And it could be in the cryptocurrency market, as Tony mentioned. That's a totally different deal than what we're talking about here. But just to do a sort of a barometric check, reach out to your utility and ask, have you received these phone calls? Where do you land as a utility on them? Because sometimes they're extraordinarily helpful. Sometimes if they're transmission constrained, as we've been talking about, it could add cost. And so I think that's the first step. And then develop your marketing strategy, like Tony said, and go out and meet with them and start opening up those conversations.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say going to the utility and having a really tight relationship with that utility is going to be really important if you do want to attract data centers, because the reality is that that's probably, other than the sales and use tax abatement or exemption legislation that you see in a lot of different states, that's the first cut line. The second one is definitely going to be power and power infrastructure. Yep. So I would make sure that those ducks are in a row before you start taking trips out to the bay or something like that.
Tony, are you willing to disclose when you talk about carbon free? Are you using RECs to do that? Is it a blended energy mix? How do you guys reach that?
It's primarily, I would say it's primarily through PPAs, but on the same grid, right? So, the big challenge is, and I think this is also true of some of the other data center providers as well, but it's got to be 100% net new energy back to the same grid that we're taking it from. So it's not like we can just go build a solar farm in Arizona to support our Ohio data center load, right? There are some other projects that are out there that are more localized, like direct offtake, but one thing we're certainly not going to do is, because it's not really achievable, is we're not going to buy 2,000 acres and build our own solar farm on it and then have that solar farm directly power the data center. There's some technical reasons why that doesn't work, but there's also some regulatory reasons why that doesn't work. Most states are not going to allow. Well, the biggest issue is we couldn't put that energy, the extra energy, back into the grid, even if we had enough space. And the second issue is the space. So we really do need a hybrid of like solar, wind. If there is nuclear on the grid, great. But we kind of, we use enough power that we kind of need everything.
So if I was to, Aaron, you gave us permission to ask questions. So sorry, I'm going to ask.
Absolutely. Go for it.
To put a plug in, Tony, for like the state of Minnesota. So they've come out with their 2040 mandate. Will that mean that you guys can go in Minnesota and hook up anywhere, knowing that you're falling under the Minnesota mandate, or will you have your own standards? Does that bring you comfort knowing that the state sort of put that flag in the ground and that's where they're going? Or do you still have your own standards no matter what a particular state does?
I guess what I would say is it does and it doesn't. So, and actually, I'm not an expert on this. We have an energy policy person who does this work. I know enough to be dangerous about it, but
sure.
We still want some control over what renewable energy we're going to be procuring and where and in what quantities. So like I know there's another state, Michigan, right now, our legislature is getting ready to do 100%, renewable bill. That works up to a point. But, we're going to purchase it in such large quantities that the reliability of that energy is very, very important. So I'd say it's helpful because it indicates that the states are going to support the utilities in making the investments that they need to get there, which means we're going to have more options when we arrive, but we will more than likely still have our own criteria that go on top of the state criteria. I mean, unless we get to the point where this wouldn't work, because we all have different definitions of what 100% carbon free or renewable actually means. But like if there was some unified policy that multiple states could pass that would be sort of a blanket standard, then that might be one way to do it. But I'm probably not going to get all the data center providers to agree on what that standard would be.
And then do you mind, does Google consider hydropower green?
It's considered carbon free.
Is it acceptable?
Yeah.
So on the energy side, just for your listeners, Aaron, like sometimes hydro works, sometimes it doesn't. Just depends on who you meet. Some people are like, we should get rid of all the dams, and they're as bad as burning natural gas or whatever. Others don't see it that way. So that's what I'm driving at. Just getting curiosity on how you guys feel about it.
Well, I mean, that's actually a good point, because that's what I mean about we don't all have the same definition of what renewable, or we don't even call it the same thing. Like we don't use our corporate policy is actually not to get to 100% renewable energy. It's to get to carbon-free energy. If you ask Amazon, it's to get to 100% renewable. That's a different thing than carbon-free. And it means that, like, for example, they don't count nuclear. They don't count hydro anymore either. It's sort of like, for Amazon, that falls in like a gray area. For Google, it's carbon-free, right? So it still fits our goal. I would be surprised if we would proactively say, yeah, let's go build more hydro. I don't think that's the direction that folks want to go, but yeah, it would work. I mean, there's a reason that Montreal had such a boom of data centers for a while, right? It's because they had an excess of hydro, which was considered carbon-free for almost everyone.
Right. Yeah, I have a question. And by the way, in the spirit of asking these questions, like I said, I want to keep it open for anybody attending that wants to ask a question. Feel free to use the Zoom question and answer function that's on here, and we will get to that. I have a question regarding disaster mitigation. I mean, it's particularly as there've been more disasters, and this question will come up next panel, also more on community resilience. But data centers, I know, are probably extra sensitive to disaster areas in general. I was curious about, as far as site selection is concerned, what are some of those pre-considerations?
For disaster mitigation?
Mm-hmm. I mean, whether it's like, being in an area where there's going to be earthquakes, or being in an area where there's going to be flooding or tornadoes or whatever it might be, blizzards for that matter, up here in Minnesota.
Yeah. So for Google, I think the answer is it kind of depends, because it depends what the data center is designed to do. So we're not as standardized in our actual facility design as a lot of the other data center providers are, think like Azure or AWS, because almost everything they do is a cloud service. The one thing that makes us different is we are our own biggest customer. Like, we got into this business because we realized we were using a lot of, server space, right? And it used to sit, actually, wish I could walk you guys down the hall and show you, like, our original servers had less storage than an iPhone, right? And that was like in 2005 or so. So the kind of data center matters in terms of risk mitigation. So, like, if it's for our stuff, like, it really doesn't matter, because the only person that's going to notice if something goes wrong is us, and we're always going to sacrifice our own stuff before customers. So, but if you're talking about like cloud, nothing, like, none of the things that you mentioned aren't things that can be engineered around. I'd say the bigger issue is the utility infrastructure that goes along with that, and how is that designed to handle any of those known environmental risks. But there are some weird ones, like we prefer not to be anywhere near rail.
It's interesting.
Just like a general blanket, it's not a good idea, because you don't really know what's going to be coming down those tracks, and we've seen one too many situations over the last couple of years where you've had train derailments, and it gets pretty big and pretty messy. So we try to avoid that. But yeah, obviously stay out of floodplains. That's probably the biggest one, because everything else you can really design around earthquakes. You can design around hurricanes and tornadoes and stuff like that. Not that we prefer it, but it can be done.
When you say near rail, put some borders around that.
I think the answer is like less than 1,000 feet. So, or we prefer to be more than 1,000 feet. So, like, one of the things that I've seen a lot of is like these, former manufacturing sites that had direct rail service, right? And a lot of them have a ton of power because they're taking raw materials in and out all the time. And if that rail line is still active and it's a freight rail line, not a passenger rail line, then that's a more significant issue.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because in our world, mine and like Catalina's, of course, when we're doing document ready sites, a lot of times rail service, lots of power, and then you get in the data center discussions, which we've had many, and it's like, but we don't want that there. It's like, we just spent a ton of money putting that there.
Yeah, I mean, if it can just be a big flat piece of land with like a nuclear power station right in the corner of it, perfect.
That'd be cool. I will hook you up.
There are a lot of those out there for sure. Maybe it's another open question. I guess curious about Catalina's perspective on it too, but as far as just workforce development, workforce requirements as it relates to data centers, what are the expectations and how much is that playing a role as far as a data center specific site selection?
Is that for me or for Tony?
Sure, you can take it first, and certainly Tony can add on.
Sure. What we are finding with data center projects and the opportunities we are working on right now is usually workforce is not, as it's been pointed out before. Usually power, water capacities, those are the things that are driving the project. For the most part, you see these very large capital investments with very large power and water requirements, but not so much on the workforce. Usually within 50 to 100, and of course that depends on the facility, but that's what we find, and usually it's not a constraint or a concern when it comes to looking into site options or location options. So that's been our experience.
And I suppose there's the construction of the facilities and all of that, assuming that they're working locally.
Exactly. That's the one thing that then becomes probably one of the major considerations when it comes to workforce is that construction piece, because then those numbers are large.
Tony, maybe you could touch on that, and then also on your opening comment about one job really being 6 jobs, create 6 jobs in the community, and support that a little bit. Because I know I just bring this up particularly because I know a lot of our clients are economic developers, and they're tasked with creating jobs. And I think that'd be interesting, because sometimes the data center in general, you'll attract one, yes, but are you creating a lot of jobs? Well, not necessarily, considering the capacity of the projects.
Right. Well, it depends on how you define it. So like, I think Catalina's nailed it, right? So for our employees, right, these are really high wage jobs, like the folks that are going to staff our data centers, they'll relocate, or we're going to find people in that market. Like, we're not having a problem with that. What we do have issues with, though, is construction labor, actually. I mean, and if there's some really great sites in some places in the middle of some southeastern states that it's just too far from anything to really be able to get like 1,000 people there to go build something. And at least in our case, and I could, from my past experience at Amazon too, this was largely the case. Once you start building a single data center, usually they tend to grow and scale because we don't really pick up and move them. Once they're there, we reinvest in those, and it almost always makes sense to do that, which means that construction labor doesn't really go anywhere. So it's not a temporary job. But if you look at our data center operations in Oklahoma, Nebraska, or Iowa, where those are kind of our original couple of data centers, we've got like 1,200 people that are working on construction that have been there for a decade. Just they go from one building to the next building to the next building. But that's 1,200 people is a lot. And then once you're up and running too, the ongoing maintenance for like HVAC, this is by far the biggest one. HVAC contractors we can't even hire them full time because they have too much work because they're so hard to get. But we need a lot of them just to keep the facilities up and running. And that actually, our workforce development team has been partnering with communities all over the country to do that training and introduce folks to that career path as well, because it's a growing need and there's great financial security in it, but we don't have enough people starting down that path. So that's the workforce side of it. So to the extent, I guess the advice for economic developers is encourage the trades, make sure you have a program to get people introduced to it and give them the option to pursue it. I would say that the just go to college and then figure it out later path is not right for everyone. It's not good for economic diversity. So we need to give people another option that don't want to pursue the academic route. So the 1 to 6 jobs. So I don't have all the details of the rest of the study yet, but we have been conducting some observational research in a couple of target markets. So we're trying not to do modeling anymore, right? Everyone's familiar with in-plan models and input outputs, and like for every job you get this many jobs, right? And it's really just a math equation, and then in reality it's whatever. So we actually have basically taken a look at some of the areas where we've invested, and we've looked, I'm going to simplify this a lot. We've looked at the net amount of employment and economic growth in those communities, agnostic, well, not agnostic of us, but like basically before and after. So if you look at 2 different snapshots in time and what the economic changes over that period of time across, we did this in 3 different continents. So we did a market in the US, we did a market in Europe, and we did a market in Asia. And the average across those 3 markets was for every data center job, you get 6 more within a regional economy, I'll say. So, and some of that is, construction labor. Some of it is trades labor. Some of it is the restaurants. Some of it is the food vendors that are coming into the office when we're having folks in from out of town, right? It's the art fairs that we put on. It's all those kinds of things. It's the additional tax revenue that's going into the school districts. That means there's construction projects at these schools, right? They're building new school buildings. That's more construction labor. So, the trickle-on effect, I mean, we're all familiar with it, but I thought it was really interesting that our research team actually was able to not do modeling, but do observational data and find out, okay, well, what is the real change on average over this period of time? Because you're right, Aaron, like folks look at data centers and they go, well, it's not a lot of jobs. And it's like, that's true. There's a lot of billion-dollar projects these days, right? And data centers are usually kind of in that category, right? But a lot of the other billion-dollar projects nowadays are like EV battery manufacturing or, cars, chip manufacturing, all that kind of stuff, right? The electrification of the economy. Those are the other billion-dollar projects that are out there. And you might say, depending on the community, and this is where community partnerships and relationships are important, I can tell you of a couple communities that, and you all could probably look these up too, that do not want 1,600 jobs in their town because they're small towns and they don't want that town to be any different, right? So sometimes for certain communities, data centers are absolutely the way to go because it's good, stable employment across multiple strata of the economy, right? Different wage levels, but we're not draining the schools, right? We're adding tax base, but we're not taking that away with 1,400 people in an elementary school classroom, right? Multiply that by the average 2.5 kids per family. That is a lot of people in your school district. It also means you got to pay for more police presence, more fire, you got more, municipal services, right? And so in terms of padding the tax base, really data centers are pretty much unbeatable. But there are more jobs that go along with a data center than people think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, housing is one of the largest issues across the country right now, and that often comes down to where are the people that are going to work here go. And I could see data centers with higher impact, economic impact jobs, yet not requiring nearly as much housing or infrastructure to bring it in.
Yep.
Well, hey, it's the top of the hour, and first of all, I want to say thank you. We should conclude the first panel. Thank you, Catalina. Thank you, Matt, and certainly thank you, Tony. Tony will be joining us on the second panel. This was very fascinating discussion, and we will be once again. This was recorded, so this is going to be shared with all of the Golden Shovel clients, as well as we have put together a white paper on site selection and with a spin on data centers that will be released at the same time after we send out the recording for our clients that are listening. So look forward to learning more about that and checking that out. At this point, Tony, do you need a small break between or do you want us to keep going?
That would be helpful, actually. So
okay, all right. Why don't we just take a few minute break and we'll get started up with the next panel.
Do I just stay here on this line, Aaron?
Yes, sir. Yep.
All right, I'll be right back.
Okay, sounds great. All right. All right. Welcome back, everybody, for the second panel of our discussion today. The second panel is it's about some of the economic development trends that are going on, and I think you're going to be really excited to hear from some of the panelists that are going to be joining us. We're going to have Tony back on again, who just was able to present before here, and I'd like to introduce two additional panelists. And the first introduction is a longtime friend, Mark Lautman, who I called this morning to check in with him, and he was standing in Santiago, Chile, in front of the looks like the State House, if I recall. Let me introduce Mark Lautman too. He's the principal of Lautman Economic Architecture. He's out in New Mexico and has had 27 years in the industry. Mark's the founding director of the Community Economics Lab, which is a fantastic not-for-profit think tank that's been working on economic development problems and solutions for a long time. Mark has also written a book, is the author of When the Boomers Bail, a Community Economic Survival Guide, which we were chatting this morning. The book's over 10 years old now, and it was all about the talent wars and the need for talent, and particularly community economic impact jobs going into communities, and that someday we're really going to be competing for this talent, and that the communities that win are going to be the ones that attract those people. And the funny thing now is, at the time when the book came out, there were so many jobs available that wasn't even an issue. It wasn't on anyone's radar. And today this book rings more true than it ever has. And lastly, I'll just say about Mark Lautman, other than being a great guy, he has worked with a whole variety of economic development organizations. I know he's the chair of the New Mexico Economic Development Commission, as well as worked with communities like Santa Teresa, Rio Rancho, and Grants, New Mexico. Welcome, Mark, to the panel.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
And then I'd also like to introduce Eric Collins. Eric Collins is the development director at the city of Centerville, Ohio. I've worked with Eric for a long time as a colleague and educator. He was previously the executive director for Montgomery County's Community and Economic Development Department. He's also a longtime educator and instructor with multiple international and national groups, including IEDC and OUEDI up in Ohio. And he has written his own curriculums and taught them on business retention and expansion. And he's going to be able to provide really valuable insights from a municipal perspective. Thank you for joining us today, Eric.
Thank you, Aaron. It's great to be here, and also to see the other panelists. And Mark, it's always good to see you.
It's always fun.
I cite your book. I cite your book all the time.
Me too.
It's a
Thank
great
you.
book.
Well, sounds good. Well, thanks, guys. This is going to be about some of the ongoing trends, and I want to open it up with Mark. You've said to me in the past that the economic development industry has changed truly fundamentally. It's just not the same thing that it once was. And what could you share about what are some of the emerging trends and considerations in site selection that economic development organizations need to be aware of?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is that it's like the physics of how economic development works changed about 2007 without anybody really knowing. That was what the book was about. It was like, hey, look, by the time, the baby boomers have retired or started to, en masse retire, there weren't going to be enough of our kids coming out of school and coming out of, mid-career change candidate as mid-career change candidates to take our place. And
Mhm.
it wasn't just us, it was most all of Europe. China had one child policy. And so everybody is really struggling with labor. The only thing that's kept it from being an absolute disaster is automation, and a few recessions and the pandemic. But basically, we didn't have enough kids to replace ourselves, and it's going to take 25 years to fix that if we fix it. And the result is there's just, the site selection business it's still you've got to pick the right site, you've got to have everything, you got to do all the stuff we used to do. But if the labor isn't there, or the labor doesn't want to live there, you could lower the cost to zero, and you're not going to get any economic development. So it's turned from a short-term tactical marketing and sales driven game to one that's really a long-term strategic, predictive, planning intensive game of building capacity. And the big difference is, besides the time frame, is that instead of, like when I got in the game in 1983, all you really need in 18 months, if you had a fairly decent strategy and your targets picked out and you knew what your inventory looked like, you could be generating prospects and closing deals in 18 months. You just had to build a team and make sure you were, dialed in right. And then your job was to go find the site selection consultants, talk to them, find out who were which groups were working with which industries, and then convince your community to lower the cost, provide incentives, give them utility concessions, lower their tax rate or give them tax abatements. You had to come up with a package to beat out your competition, and you won. And all you had to do was enough projects every year to offset the jobs that you were losing, because everybody's losing all the time. And you could gain a little, and you'd have your household, your local businesses, and your tax abated institutions all have a little more money per person to serve, and life would be good. A completely different physics today. Now it's like so we used to go recruit companies, bring them in, they would hire people, there'd be more tax base, we'd go improve the schools, improve downtown, do all these nice things to make our community nicer. Now you have to make the community nicer to attract the talent, to attract the job. So it's just completely flipped. And I don't think most professionals actually understand that thing has completely reversed and it's turned into a planning intensive game. So the communities that are going to win are ones that can plan 10 to 12 years out on what they're going to need workforce wise, infrastructure wise, utility capacity wise, housing wise. If they could figure that out, and you have to predict what kind of jobs you're going to have first. If you can do that, and you can get the community behind a plan to do it, and you can resist the political temptation to spend on the money on stuff people want yesterday, you'll win. And if you can't, you're SOL, I think. So it's a brand
Thank
new
you.
game. If you can't plan, if you don't, and we don't have, economic developers have no planning game, in my opinion. They're not, what we produce are not real plans, and the communities aren't behind them. We talk about how do you fix that. It's a steep hill.
Wow, thanks. Well, that's a good way to open up this discussion. Let me pass it over to, I want to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing, and I'll run this question to you, Tony, also. But first, I want to ask Eric a question about technology. I mean, Eric's no stranger to the early adoption of technologies, but particularly around AI, and Tony touched on a little bit on his opening about the data center impact, but what do you see as far as AI affecting the economic development industry, and whether it's in the business, attraction side or business side, but also just as the EDO industry as a whole?
Well, it's certainly a disruptive industry, and I think it's still very much in its infancy in terms of how business, public sector, more importantly, private sector, how everyone's trying to figure it out and what the implications are. There's a lot of hype, that on AI. Right now, I mean, if you go on the internet, you'll see ChatGPT. Tony, you talked about it. Bard is another example with Google. The CEO of Google was talking about it in a recent interview, national television earlier this year, about kind of where things are going. So there is a lot of hype. There's a lot of, uncertainty of exposure for businesses, of applications to businesses. And I think they're really trying to work through it, but it is disruptive. And I'll give you some examples. I mean, if you look, for example, in the medical industry, pathology, for example, the old school was, let me look at those glass slides and see where there's sickness or concerns. And now with the ability of AI scanning the slides, they can do it probably 1 million times faster to look for those red flags in a patient, for a patient to find out what's wrong with that patient. So medical healthcare field, it's really impacting. Also, look at fields like the legal space. You have e-discovery. You have a lot of law firms around the world that are now using AI to do a lot of research faster on case studies. So I think that's, it's very disruptive. And so you look at us in economic development, and to Mark's point, in the old days and the new days, now it's like, okay, let's look at the magic 8-ball or the crystal ball and see strategically, okay, we want to go after certain types of, there's a difference, clusters or sectors, right? And what do we think, to Mark's point about planning, what is it we want to be? And then are we planning, I used to ask questions with business retention to CEOs. Hey, Tony, you're a CEO of a company. What do you think it's going to be like in 6 months or 5 years from now? And, the way the velocity of change is happening now, you may not know in 6 weeks what's happening. I mean, there are a lot of changes in speed. So from the economic development standpoint, yes, we have to be focused as we try to attract new investment. We certainly have to know our community. We have to know what types of resources and workforce infrastructure, site infrastructure that's there to support it, and to be nimble enough to accommodate those types of companies, those different industry clusters, or as we build them out, or growing a sector.
Right. I'm curious from what Mark's opening comments were about automation solving being really the only reason why we haven't lost our minds with the lack of talent. Maybe AI will play a role in that also, in helping take care of some of the jobs that aren't going to be able to be filled. Tony, what are your thoughts on that? And to speak of that, I just saw, I think it was a week ago, an article on Google, and that their latest comments. I mean, there's supposedly the whatever you guys are building behind the scenes is 5 times faster and more powerful than even what we've seen from like ChatGPT. That's exciting, thrilling, kind of scary, and at the same time, I think it's an interesting place for Google to be with considering search. But just from your perspective, maybe you could share what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, just from a AI, well, let me put it this way, right? Like, Google's mission has always been to organize and make accessible the world's data, right? Like, that's why we are what we are, is because you could, I mean, people absolutely freaked out when they realized you could just type something into a search bar and all of a sudden you could find any piece of information on earth. You didn't have to go to a library, right? So disruption, I guess, in terms of like yeah, it's different than what we used to do. But then again, I think we had this same conversation 100 years ago when we started making rubber tires instead of wagon wheels, and there was a carpenter somewhere who was like, "Well, now what do I do?" Right? And the answer is adapt, and we move into something else, right? We are obviously as a company extremely bullish on AI capabilities, but I think really I don't see it in any way necessarily replacing jobs. What I see it doing is making people more able to do more in the job that they already have, right? And Eric laid out a couple of examples where there's already folks that are doing these jobs, who are just doing it faster and better. We've had all kinds of technology disruptions before, right? Like, we used to have to keep track of our books on those big accounting books that were on paper, right? And then Excel came along and made it way easier. Now there's all kinds of different things we can do. So I don't know that that's yet impacting economic development. I'm sure it will at some point, but I do think Mark's point about you have to go, well, two things that are really important. I strongly agree with this, and I can think of some examples, is like, know what you want to be as a community when you grow up. Like, a town that I think has done that incredibly well is Columbus, Ohio. They had a plan, they executed on that plan, and they've been flexible and adaptable. And specifically, if you want to look inside of Columbus, Ohio, I would give huge credit to New Albany and the New Albany company for also knowing, okay, we're going to market this site to this specific industry. We're going to have all the infrastructure set up and ready to go. All the permits are there, off the shelf, ready to go. Speed, capacity, really what they did well, if I had to boil it down, is they took all the long lead item blockers like power capacity and zoning and all those kinds of things off the table and said, all right, we solved all that already. And now we can be flexible and adaptable to who wants to come and take advantage of that opportunity. I would strongly encourage EDOs to kind of replicate that model. Is like, you have to just take care of the stuff that companies are not going to be able to solve quickly. So plan around the long-term items, but then give yourself enough flexibility with the short-term stuff to still respond to different challenges and opportunities. So that, I think those are all really good points. The other trend that I would highlight, and this is more, preface this and say this is more me talking than anybody from Google, but I don't personally think our situation with China is getting any better anytime soon. And to me, that if I'm an EDO right now, I'm going to start thinking about what are we heavily dependent on the Chinese for today? Because 5, 6, 7 years from now, we're going to be making it in the US, right? The CHIPS Act was kind of a canary in the coal mine, I think, of primarily the Department of Defense, but also large technology companies going to the federal government and saying, like, hey, if we ever have a security situation, let's say in Taiwan, and we don't have access to these microchips, we need to understand the impact to our economy of not having chips. And we saw some of that during COVID just by having chip production slow down, right? Cars were sitting on the lots with like no infotainment systems. They were built cars that didn't work because they didn't have chips. The military also needs a lot of these raw basic materials for weapons guidance systems or avionics systems, right? But the entire US military runs on microchips just like the rest of the economy. And I think that was like a moment that snapped people awake to, oh my gosh, we are way, way too dependent on a supply chain and a manufacturing cluster that we don't control and is subject to the whims of geopolitics. So you do see the federal government acting on some of those items, but I think large companies are going to start factoring that into their supply chain and their production planning, and they're going to want to, like, we've been talking about onshoring for years in economic development, but I think it's actually going to start happening because also the costs are starting to shift as well, right? Like transportation costs, given where oil is at right now, that's shifting the balance of whether it makes sense to make things overseas anymore. And China's rising middle class demanding higher wages and some of the things that are going on over there. I think it's more and more likely that stuff is going to start to continue to grow in the United States, and manufacturing is going to grow in the United States. And where is that more likely to go? It's going to go to the same places that I'm probably looking for data centers with tons of power and the infrastructure that's ready to go, which means the Midwest, right? They've got lots of water, they've got lots of power. Those are the kinds of places that had that manufacturing core, and they're going to, I think, get it back. They're also the place with, I can't say for sure that like that's where people want to live, but the net migration trends away from some of the larger cities that occurred during COVID and folks like me that moved back to their hometowns in the Midwest for a better cost of living, that's a lot of people. It's also the parts of the country that are growing demographically in terms of just like number of kids per household. There's more people coming out of the Midwest and the Southeast really than there is from either of the coastal regions. So everybody that's ending up in the coastal regions is like, was going there. Now they're coming back out and going to the middle of the country.
Hey, Tony, if I can add too, to your point about like microchips, for example, there's a great book by Chris Miller. I'd recommend everyone, if you haven't read it, it's called The Chip War. It's an excellent book that kind of, outlines the history of microchips and where we are today, from what's happening with Intel, to your point, in the New Albany or Columbus region, but going back to Taiwan, what's happening in China, and all the things that you were covering. So it's a great book I'd recommend to everyone, The Chip War.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I was just thinking, during COVID or kind of towards the end of that already, the onshoring of starting with the storage, so first it was, all right, we're not going to deal with this supply chain business anymore. And suddenly the cost of warehousing and cold storage and all those likes just flew through the roof. But right behind that, I suppose, is all of the manufacturing that's going to be going into the storage too. Let me get a question over to you, Mark, about all of everything we've talked about so far. And I really appreciated Tony's comments about, hey, look at what China's doing. And, how do we've got to figure out where we're going to be in 5 years and what kind of things we're going to attract. How does a community go about making that plan? Like effectively, where it's not going to be something that's going to just cater to whatever the whims are of a particular board that year, but instead something that's really going to have a strong impact on the community.
Well, when I wrote When the Boomers Bail, my wife was really critical of the book because it basically laid out the problem and it was existential to a lot of places. I mean, most places in the US the last 20 years have made no economic development progress at all. And she said, hey, you laid out the problem, but you had nothing in the book about solutions. And it was true. I wrote it kind of as a thesis. Could this really actually happen? And is this really, and so for the last 12 years or so, we've been working, our group's been working, okay, what could you do about it? And it always comes back to planning and the fact that we don't do any real planning. We're just reacting right now. Tell us what the site selectors are telling us they need right today, which you needed to be investing for 7 years ago to be in the game today. And so, and the real problem, I think, from a trend standpoint is, and there's a book by Rita McGrath called The End of Strategic Advantage that you ought to read, which is based on the premise that because the acquisition of human knowledge and productive capacity is expanding at a accelerating rate. So it's an acceleration curve that we don't know where it ends, but we're in the middle. It's they call it Kurzweil's curve. So it's basically a curve that goes vertical at some point. And what happens is the rate at which we're learning things and able to produce things is increasing exponentially. So what would happen normally, you could wait for 15 or 20 years. So 70 years was about the length of time you could depend on an automotive factory employing people in your community in the Midwest back in the 50s. We recruited the world's largest photovoltaic manufacturer to Albuquerque in my last gig in Albuquerque, and they were gone in 4 years because the Chinese took the market. And so the life cycle of companies is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, what it really means is that your attrition rate is going up. So you have to create more jobs, more transactions, just to offset, because you got to offset all the jobs you lost to make any progress against your unemployment situation if you have one. And if you're growing, if you need more jobs on top of that to support those new households. So depending on your scenario, you should be able to, decide or predict how many people you're going to have living here in 10 years, or you want, and what rate your attrition is having. Nobody's measuring attrition. So how many jobs, and you look at economic based jobs, service sector jobs still grow in proportion. It's just that they're being automated too, so you don't get as high a multiplier as you used to. You used to get, 2.5 jobs for every job in Albuquerque. Now it's close to 1 to 1.3 or something.
Wow.
So it's going down. So basically, we have to be creating more jobs. We don't realize it. We're still all doing the same thing we were doing 20 years ago for the most part. So I think I just don't see how anybody does better than they're doing now. What Kenny's doing and has been doing in Columbus was but he had a really smart group of people on his board.
Mm-hmm.
Most communities don't have people that actually understand the economy on their boards making decisions. They don't go through a planning process, so they never are confronted with the kind of questions they have to answer. And, I think you got the biggest problem of all right now is that most of the economic development groups don't have a constituency anymore, because when you talk to them, you find out it takes a while for them to admit it, but half the people that were pounding the table for more jobs so their businesses would have more demand and be able to grow are now afraid that if you recruit a company, Eric, you bring a company in, they're going to lose their 2 best people to that company. So the constituency that supported economic development isn't there anymore. And so, and really, it's not the end of the world, because you need a different constituency anyway. You need people because most communities in the U.S., they're not going to be able to supply the workforce if they can't mine talent out of their hard to employ, chronically poor populations. It goes from a liability to an asset. And so you need people that understand poverty alleviation and how to train up people that really didn't get skilled up or educated in the first place. What part of the economy can they work in? But you can't do it with a few business guys, some developers, and some utility people anymore. You need the entire community convened in some way to do all the planning, because it's way more work than anybody's doing.
And that includes K-12 education and higher ed. Now the term is modern elderly, those who have retired that can still work.
Yeah.
The new buzzword, right? But it's the whole community, if you will.
And I don't know any place, I don't know, maybe you guys do, I don't know any place that's really integrated an economic development strategy that's defined with a workforce development strategy. So how many do you have to bring in? How many can you grow out of your own school systems? How many mid-career change candidates can you convert every year? I don't know anybody that's integrated and calibrated their workforce operations with their job creation operation. And I think most of the reason you can't is because we don't iterate our side. But
I think there are efforts. Harvard right now, they're doing an initiative out of the Kennedy School in terms of pathways to prosperity, which is that model of working with school systems, K-12, and then higher ed, and finding out what those demand types of jobs are, and engaging business advisory councils throughout the country. And it might be something worth everyone taking a look at as far as pathways to prosperity. But as we all know, Mark, it's a multifaceted approach, isn't it? I mean, it's tough. It's tough work.
Well, the pathway, I think they've done a really good. Educators, people, especially in community colleges, if you tell them what the job is, they can get a curriculum set up. They can get them trained in a short amount of time. They know how to do it. The problem is nobody's telling them what jobs are likely to demand in the way of skills and education in the future. And so the kids can understand where they're going and what they might be able to do. And it's so hard now because the market changes in 5 years.
Yeah.
But most of the jobs that you train for, 80% of those skills end up transferable to something else. So it's just, I don't think the educators care about economic development, and I don't think the economic developers care about education right now.
I think it's, yeah, I think generally you're right on the money. I mean, there is some movement. I could see it in different places.
We're in the same game now. It should just be put together
completely.
You know, like chambers and EDOs used to be together. Workforce development and economic development ought to be the same enterprise.
Yeah.
That's yeah.
Wow, that's a lot. Thanks, guys. That's really interesting conversation.
Oh yeah, we could go on, could we?
No. Oh, I know you guys both could. Tony, outside, I mean, I understand that, you know, we just had a whole thing on data centers, and they require, like, yes, you have to have a great site, you have to have a lot of resources and all of that. But let's assume that we got the power, we got the water, we got the site. What are the things about a community that are having the most impact with discussions over at Google? Like, when it outside of like, do they have the stuff to set up and run, or is that not too big of a consideration? How much does quality of life for the communities themselves and some of the other things that they're going to the efforts to attract workers with play a role in the decision making of projects in Google?
You know, it really hasn't yet. And I think the reason for that is because there are so few places with all of those prerequisites that you just mentioned. So like in practice, there's, you know, we have to find the unicorn sites that have all that infrastructure. And, you know, kind of just dovetailing onto this broader conversation about like workforce and planning, right? What we're doing as an industry, though, is just finding, generally speaking, I would say, is finding places where that infrastructure has been abandoned. It was never planned really to be there, right? It was abandoned by some other industry, and then we come in and we scoop it up. But very few communities are really putting together a strategic plan to actually build the infrastructure to, you know, attract because we are ultimately an infrastructure ourselves, right? We're the digital infrastructure of all of these new tools that we're going to be using to be more productive. So, you know, we also, it's kind of incumbent on us too, I think, to the point about education though, like, and I've always, in many of my roles, made an effort to do this, is like, I started a lot of economic development conversations when we were looking at communities with school districts. That was usually the first person we would talk to. And we'd want to know, like, what are they interested in? What are the, you know, where are they feeding their kids into? Are they mostly going to the trade school or the community colleges down the road? Are they mostly going to, you know, University of Michigan, Ohio State? Depends which school district you're talking about. And then, like, they can't predict, I think, to Mark's point, like, how are they supposed to predict what we need? If we're the ones creating all this cutting edge technology, like, it is kind of incumbent on us to actually go out to these institutions and tell them what we need and when we need it so that they can develop it. Because we've had great experiences, like you said, with community colleges just saying, like I'll give you an example. We were running out of people to be able to connect the fiber optic cables that make all the data centers run, or your internet service, for example, run. Like, if a fiber optic cable needs to get laid, it has to get welded together, which takes a specific, you know, skill set. What economic development agency is actually thinking about that? Why would they even know that that's a skill that needs to be there? They probably wouldn't, unless they, you know, had someone that worked in this industry, right? And to your point, unfortunately, most of those economic development agencies are just not going to be competitive places to pull people out of industry anymore. So why would they know? Well, I mean, we basically have to tell them, I think. So, you know,
you have to be asked. You have to be asked. The community needs to ask, say, we are thinking about targeting you. What are you going to need so we can be ready? If they don't ask you, I mean, you could tell teachers all day long what they ought to be teaching, and they're not going to teach it. They need to be that's where the planning process comes in. If the planning process doesn't convene teachers and people who care about poverty, people across the political spectrum, and town hall the thing, then they'll never ask you.
That's right.
They have, if they're going to implement it, they have to ask you, and that's what's not happening.
Yeah.
And you as a so you're right. I agree. And you know, you have to understand your community. You have to understand, you know, call it a SWOT analysis: strengths, you know, opportunities, weaknesses, all that. But Tony, I'm glad you brought it up, because I was just at a company yesterday, the North American headquarters for Yaskawa Moto Man. They're a robotics company. So I know we've been talking a little bit about AI and how that's going to impact workforce, but then also automation. And Heather McGowan, who is out of Boston and New York, talks about the velocity of change. And Tony, to your point, 100 years ago, what do we have? In the 50s, we started having, television, and then later the internet and other types of technologies. So Yaskawa, they're based out of Japan, but they have their US operations. What they have been doing is they have been reaching out to schools and saying, okay, we want to get your students into our facility, and we're going to go ahead and teach you on what we're going to need, and skill those students up for either entry level types of positions, or they go on to vocational or other types of vocational training or college training. But they educated about 2,200 students last year alone in regional high schools. But they made a comment, they have to go deeper into the K-12 system to start educating them, to build that pipeline, that because they recognize that more automation is going to occur, side by side. Sometimes people will go away, but they're going to need skills to train them on the robots and the software and so forth. So I think, that's an important thing too, that industry like Google or like Yaskawa, what they're trying to do, they're reaching in. And that's going to make a difference. That's definitely going to make a difference.
I mean, just the Golden Shovel's career track of the last 14 years, I think the first third is a lot of business attraction, focusing on business traction. Then the next third was all about workforce traction and getting everybody to move there. And like recently, over the last few years, that's not even as feasible as it used to be, because there isn't housing, or there isn't the right to catch them. So instead, now it's career exploration and getting the people that are growing up in your own town, that are already living there, to get excited about the jobs that are available in your own community. And even that, even though there has been a massive shift to like a comment Tony made previous panel about getting into not necessarily going to a four-year university, but getting into the trades and finding really high-paying jobs that are immediately available just to go in there. But like the work we've done with the virtual reality and the goggles, that's turned into going to your local employers, finding out what they do, and then bringing it to the high schools so that the high school kids would be interested. And then we show up at the high schools, and they're like, a lot of the high school kids already know what they want to do. You really got to be talking to the junior high kids. And I'm telling you, 14 years ago, after talking to senior site consultants, that at some point we'd be focusing on junior high kids to make sure that the jobs are going to get filled. I just didn't see that coming. And that's the situation right now. We got to get them interested as early as possible so that they can get excited about those jobs, so that they can stay in the community. I mean, there's so many chickens and so many eggs to figure out what to do first. It's I can see where it's really challenging. And I see that particularly, we just had that whole discussion about data centers. I mean, Tony, you're talking about, we're looking for stuff that was abandoned because there's such a long lead time to build out what's necessary, what you really want. You don't have 5-10 years to do it. I mean, how do we get started knowing, I mean, first of all, I mean, it's hard to invest all of that money and energy into building out a giant power plant at the end of a 100-acre lot, just to make sure that that's going to be available, and then not knowing if it's going to happen for sure, even though it seems at this point like, no, that'll get taken. That'll probably get bought before it even gets started, kind of considering the increasing demands. I'm curious about that. And
well, yeah, I mean, especially because, like, just to compound this issue a little bit, right? I mean, I sort of said it in my opening, like, this is the big trend I think is going to happen, but there are other industries now that are competing for that same infrastructure, right? Like, so if you look at where manufacturing and data centers are close together, it's like EV battery manufacturing or some kind of, electric vehicle production or some element of its supply chain. And then there's like a data center right next door. There's a reason for that. It's because we're chasing the same infrastructure. And actually, this is kind of a wild theory, but I'm going to throw this out there too. When you combine the increasing demand on energy grids with some of the plans I've seen to electrify all of the cars on the road, the amount of strain on our electrical grids is within 10 years, unless we change the amount of capacity that's available, is going to wildly outstrip the amount of energy that's actually available. Mm-hmm. So something has to give, and I guarantee you it's probably not going to be the digital services that every business in the world relies on, as opposed to your Tesla, which is probably not going to get prioritized in terms of charging, because some other major industry is going to need it. So I don't have data to back that up yet, but I can tell you it is on the minds of every policy person in the automotive industry as well. They're very worried about the actual, infrastructure and capacity to support that transition, which is not there. And there is no federal government plan, even though it's a federal government mandate to go in that direction. The federal government is doing almost nothing to support the infrastructure transition that is necessary to support that policy transition. Okay, so now this affects more than just automotive and, the gas-powered car or whatever, the Mustang that sits in your garage, right? This is a bigger issue than that, because some of these trends are going to converge, and I think they're likely to converge at the same time. So we need to start thinking about, it would be great if someone, running for elected office at the federal level was even talking about this as a problem, because it's probably I would definitely die on this hill that I think the lack of available energy infrastructure in the United States is the greatest barrier to our economic development as a country, period. Because there are just way too many highly energy intensive industries that would love to continue growing and expanding in the US that are being hamstrung by the lack of available power today. And especially carbon-free energy. So, and that's kind of a separate discussion, like how do you make all that energy carbon free, but like we do need more energy in this country, and we need it quickly.
Hey Tony, have you thought about like what would happen if Google came up with a 10-year strategy that and then market that to 15 to 20, 30 locations in the country where you would like to see, where you would like to be, and just take the package and say, hey, if you guys do this. So we did kind of the same thing when I was working for Forest City in Albuquerque, and I spent 14 months going around to all the site selection consultants in the country, talking to them about a handful of industries we thought we could support in Albuquerque. And when I worked with Tim Nitty at KLG in Manhattan, and he told me, when I told him about we're going to run out of labor, and where are you going to, so for the financial services industry, where are you going to go? Because where they are now, there's no capacity left. There's no housing. People are going to get stuck in 2-hour commutes each way, that sort of thing. He goes, well, yeah. So I think it was Sarah Abrams was the HR person for Fidelity Investments. And she's the one that she brought the first project to Albuquerque under my watch and said, you broke the code. This is the new game. And what our pitch was, Forest City's pitch was, we're going to build a new city within the city of Albuquerque. We had 20,000 acres. We're going to build 38,000 houses. It was a master plan community thing that Albert Ratner wanted to do. They had the same thing going on in Denver at the old airport, at Stapleton Airport. We said, look, I walked into the site selection office, and the company's offices that were on our target said, hey, this company is the largest master plan community developer in the country. Albert Ratner is a visionary, wants to design a place around the needs of your future employees. Are you interested in a conversation, a charrette with the architects? We got Peter Calthorpe, who's the new urbanist guru. And would your company's, futurists sit down with us and tell us what the parameters of a perfect location, so you could steal talent from your competitors, not have them stolen back. And that's how the discussion started. So, okay,
Yeah.
can we get the University of New Mexico, which is 4 minutes away from the site, can we get them to start changing their curriculum and beef up this department, much like what Columbus, Ohio did, and what Phoenix has done. And so I'm just wondering if there's anything along those lines. I thought Amazon should have done that instead of, compete out put a bunch of communities against each other for the lowest bid. But
Yeah. Well, that's a story for another time, but yeah. So funny you say that, because I mean, I have thought about that. Is that something that we want to do, is like call it a like a site readiness program or whatever. But so to your point about like how wildly the economic development landscape has changed, like, like when I started the governor's office, I was spending all my time talking to consultants, asking them what they need. And now I sit here on the other side of the fence and we're making site selection decisions. And I feel like I have to go out
There you
and
go,
tell
Mark.
people what to do, because this is what we need.
Yeah.
And it's a completely different world. So yeah, I've definitely thought about it, because it's complicated. And the other thing too is like, I'm keenly aware, by the way, that a community going and saying to AEP or whoever the energy provider is, like, I need 5 sites that are 100 acres apiece with 80 megawatts of power on day one, and I need it to not be passed on to every other user on the grid, but the power still has to be cheap enough for the company to come, and all these things is not an easy thing to ask for, unless they have the ability to say, well, we talked to so-and-so at Google or Amazon, and they said, if we do this, then that would, we'd be on the list. The drawback to that when you're on the company side of things, though, is then you create the expectation that for sure that is what's going to happen. So we have to manage expectations. And I am not going to tell a community that I'm going to show up and do something if I'm not 100% sure that I'm going to do it. Like, I always under promise and over deliver. So that's the one thing that gives me some heartburn about that type of model. But I do, on the flip side, I do a lot more things like this now, where if communities do want to know and they are asking the questions, I don't ever say no.
Yeah, it's really for the future though, because it takes, like I said, it takes 10 years to get this stuff organized. And you can't just be talking to one person, because usually the EDO director is there for 5 years. They aren't in there for a long time for business cycles like Eric. He's rare. Most of the time you're just in there for a while, and then the politics change, and every election cycle you got a new strategy nobody wants to do what the guys before did. So you have to have this constituency of people around you that believe in the program and are willing to put their shoulder into it for 3 or 4 business cycles and 3 or 4 election cycles at least. And most places can't even get close to doing that. So it would be finding those guys and saying, hey, look, you got, understand that most of them are pretty smart. It's like, hey, look at our business. It's going to change a lot. Our power requirements could change. Our site requirements could change. But what we're looking for are some communities that are asking the right questions and willing to plan ahead. Yeah. And if so, we'd be happy to have you on that list because we think you have some promise, something like that. But I think unless you're dangling that carrot, I'm not sure communities are going to shift enough to actually start planning, because right now they're not doing any planning. They do the SWOT analysis and then call it a strategic plan, and they don't do any operational planning. They don't link the capacity building with any of their job creation. There's no official link, and they don't attempt to manage the capacity building, which is what they need to do.
It's more frankly, it's more tactical.
Tactics.
And it's like, we want, but what do you have behind you as far as a strategy is really, and that's a game changer, by knowing your environment and then focusing and going after it. To your point, I mean, I was at my place a long time. We did a major plan, an analysis, And then we went after it. Aviation, because of where we are in the world, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for maintenance, repair, overhaul, for example, or logistics and other types of manufacturing, aerospace. But the point is, and to your point, Mark, is, you know, a lot of communities, there are a lot of communities that are doing it, but a lot more need to be really focused on planning
It
and then reaching out.
makes me wonder about like those with the workforce shortage and the fear of AI taking jobs, or I'm thinking of, you'd mentioned Tesla, Tony, and it popped in my mind about that Optimus biped robot that's gonna be able to walk around factory floors and work with humans. You know, what role those types of things are going to play, assuming there's a power available, I guess, because they're going to be charged up.
Yeah.
But what role they're going to play in filling the gaps so that those new factories that come back without the people to be able to support them run. I mean, it's going to be crazy.
I just wonder about places like Charlotte. So I was talking to Ronnie Bryant the other day. I was like, what is that place going to do 10 years from now when AI has changed all of the banking and insurance businesses?
Exactly.
Maybe even wiped them out. What are so
Bank of America.
What's your thoughts for the next economic base, you know?
Right. Well, there'll be jobs available
Yeah.
on the street, probably.
And that's how you have to be thinking, I think, that to get out of this, and otherwise you're going to be just staying reactive. And 90% of the communities are not in the game anymore.
You know, Mark, you know, along those lines with automation, with AI, some jobs will stay, and you know, we probably have heard there are a lot of jobs that haven't even been created yet, right? The jobs, the positions haven't even been developed yet. But the other thing too, from an economic development standpoint, is the incentives that had historically been used based on numbers of jobs. And I think that's a real disruptive piece for economic development folks, because that's how we've historically measured outcomes, you know, based on revenue coming in, good money coming into the economy, you know, those kinds of things. I don't think a lot of folks are thinking about that either. How are they structuring deals? So big.
Well,
no, I think
we started that conversation during COVID.
Oh, 100%. And then look at the office spaces in the United States, how it's bleeding right now. Yeah.
Well, Aaron and I were talking on the warm-up call I had a couple hours ago with him, saying, you know, what's really, I mean, if you accept the acceleration premise, so 20 years is 5 years, or 20 years is actually 10 years, then, you know, just think about an AI is going to destroy jobs. And it's good that we are going to be able to produce everything we need with a lot less of our workforce in the future.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to need people for entertainment and all that stuff. Not that you won't have anything to do, but the problem is most of the work that's done in most economies is not paid. It's people working out to keep themselves healthy. It's taking care of kids. It's not paid. And you volunteer, you're helping you paint your neighbor's house because, you know, they're sick. You know, but there's tons of work, which is the expenditure of energy being done by human beings. It's not paid. It doesn't show up in GDP. It's not part of the economic development business. And yet the quality of your life of people living in your city could be, you know, markedly better, and not say any increase in GDP. It's just you've got people helping each other more. So we're going to have to figure out, I think, soon another set of metrics for the non-paid part of the economy, and respect that kind of work as much as the other. Because I think, you know, I'd say one other thing that came to mind while you guys were talking was, I think AI is the one thing that could fix education. And I know the Chinese are already doing this. When I was over there, it was like a couple of years ago, I visited a classroom where they had an AI, basically a camera on all the kids' faces, and the machine could tell when that kid wasn't paying attention or wasn't learning. And they knew what kind of learner. Were they an auditory learner or visual learner? What kind of learner were they? And the teacher would go over and they basically address it within 30 seconds of when the kid kind of drifted off. And so I think AI, I love the fact that it makes stuff up to make us happy, but I think AI is going to be a game changer on every level, but I think it could fix a lot of the things that are wrong with education.
I'll to your point, and for everyone who's listening live or on the recording, Harvard just actually back-to-back issues. One is it's how generation or Gen AI and the new age of human creativity, how revolutionary technology can enhance rather than replace our powers of imagination. That's the July-August one, and then we get to the September-October issue, which I think is really good too. It's about reskilling in the age of AI, new approaches for managers and employees. So two really good back-to-back HBR articles and segments. So I recommend it.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, it seems like we're gonna with too many jobs and not enough people, we're gonna need to be able to do more with less. And it sounds like this technologies are gonna have a big impact on that. Well, we are have lots of other questions for you guys. I wish we could just go longer, but we're running out of time. Mark, thank you so much for joining and participating from taking time off in Chile to jump on the call. Thank you, Eric, for popping on and just sharing your thoughts. And I think this was really interesting. And special thanks to you, Tony, just for sticking it out through 2 panels. I really appreciate that. And your insights were incredibly valuable. I think everyone's going to hear them. We're going to leave with a different perspective.
Tony, thanks for everything you do and your company does. You guys are the future.
Well, thank you all for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure to chat and enjoyed it. We'll, probably keep having more of these as AI keeps going forward and keeps changing. But one thing's for sure, we have to do that as economic development practitioners as well, right? We can't just remain stagnant and keep doing the same stuff we've been doing. So,
well, great. Well, thank you.
You have enough sites.
Right. Well, that gave us direction. We got to make sure that that everything's ready to sell, so you can buy it. You're going to need it. Sounds like. So maybe we'll have this conversation again in 50 years, and it'll be all AI. Just avatars having the discussion about what's next and what to do with the few humans that are left. Hey, I hope not. Hey, thank you so much. This has been a real pleasure, and everybody, take care. And to our clients, thank you. This has been recorded, so you have an opportunity to watch it again and share it with your constituents. So thank you, guys.